if your greatest success was built on a shameful secret? In 1995, a powerful CEO abandoned her black twins, fleeing the truth. Until 30 years later, they returned to her boardroom, ready to unravel her past and rewrite their future. Julia Harper gripped the edge of the hospital chair in Louisville, Kentucky, her knuckles pale against the cold metal, the sharp scent of disinfectant stinging her nostrils. At 29, she was a phenomenon in the financial world, the youngest CEO of Harper Investments, her name a quiet murmur in the exclusive circles of power and wealth. She'd spent years climbing the corporate ladder, her ambition a shield against the whispers of doubt that trailed a young woman in a... Her husband, Daniel, had been her anchor through the whirlwind, his warm hand steadying hers as she went into labor 3 weeks early, their shared excitement a rare moment of vulnerability for a woman who thrived on control. Now, after hours of pacing the maternity ward, a nurse approached, her smile soft but tired. "Ms. Harper, your twins are here," she said, her voice a gentle hum amid the sterile chaos. Julia stood, her heels clicking sharply on the linoleum floor, her mind swirling with dreams of a perfect family, a final piece to complete the flawless life she'd so carefully constructed. The neonatal unit was a cocoon of quiet intensity, the soft beeps of monitors, a steady heartbeat as the nurse led her to an incubator. Inside, 2 tiny infants lay side by side, their delicate fingers curled into fists, their skin a deep, rich brown. Far darker than Julia's porcelain complexion or Daniel's light Italian olive tone. Julia froze, her breath catching like a shard of glass in her throat, her vision narrowing to the small, fragile forms before her. "These can't be right," she stammered, her voice trembling, each word a fragile thread about to snap. The nurse's brow creased, her tone firm but laced with empathy. "These are your twins, ma'am, a boy and a girl." Julia's gaze locked on the infants, her mind spiraling into a storm of disbelief. Daniel's heritage was Italian, hers was English. How could their children look like this? In 1995, in the conservative, high society world she inhabited, this wasn't just a shock. It was a scandal that could unravel everything. Whispers of judgment already haunted her as a female CEO. Now, the idea of raising black children in a world quick to sneer at anything different filled her with a dread she couldn't name. "I need to speak with my husband," Julia snapped, her voice cutting through the air like a blade as she turned away from the incubator, her heart pounding with a toxic mix of shame and fury. The nurse hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes flickering with concern. "He stepped out to make a call, ma'am," she said, her voice softer now, as if sensing the storm brewing within Julia. But Julia couldn't wait. She couldn't bear the weight of those tiny, innocent eyes, so unlike her own, staring back at her. She stormed through the maternity ward, past pastel balloons and beaming families, their joy a cruel contrast to the chaos erupting inside her. The humid Kentucky air hit her like a wall as she reached the parking lot, her trembling hands fumbling for the keys to her sleek Mercedes. She dropped them twice, her polished nails scraping the pavement as she scrambled to pick them up, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Her perfect life, her carefully curated image as a trailblazing CEO, a woman who had it all, was unraveling with every shaky step, and she couldn't face the whispers, the judgment, the inevitable sneers from her elite peers. She wouldn't. Julia drove straight to her office, the city blurring past her in a haze of streetlights and shadows, her phone buzzing relentlessly on the passenger seat, Daniel trying to reach her, no doubt, his calls a reminder of the life she was about to shatter. By the next morning, she'd filed for divorce, her signature sharp and final on the papers, leaving a cold handwritten note for Daniel to handle the fallout alone. Take care of them. "I can't." She told herself the twins couldn't possibly be hers, that Daniel must have betrayed her, that this was some cruel mistake of biology or fate. In the quiet of her office, surrounded by the trappings of her success, polished mahogany desks, framed awards, the faint hum of a city that never slept, she buried the memory deep, locking it away like a dangerous secret that could destroy her. She vowed never to look back, her resolve as cold as the steel of her skyscraper office. Chicago became her new battleground, a fresh start where she poured every ounce of her energy into building Harper Investments into a financial empire, each deal a brick in the wall she'd built between her and the family she'd left behind. But some truths, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of clawing their way back to the surface, their roots too stubborn to be ignored. 30 years later, Julia stood in her Chicago office, her silver hair catching the faint glow of dawn, the glittering skyline a mirror to the empire she'd built, and the empire now on the verge of collapse. Harper Investments, once a titan in the financial world, was crumbling under the weight of a series of failed deals, and Julia, now 59, felt the foundation of her legacy slipping away like sand through her fingers. She'd spent decades crafting an image of unshakable success, her name synonymous with power and precision, but the cracks were showing, and the boardroom whispers were growing louder. Her CFO, Margaret, a woman with a mind as sharp as her tailored suits, knocked briskly on the door before stepping inside, her expression grim. "The Sterling Group backed out," Margaret said, her voice taut with urgency, her hands clutching a stack of reports that spelled disaster. "We're out of options, Julia. We need a new investor, or this company is finished." Julia sank into her chair, her jaw clenched, her fingers tracing the edge of her desk as if she could hold on to her empire through sheer will. She'd built this company from nothing, fought through every glass ceiling, and now it was all at risk. Margaret hesitated, her gaze softening slightly as she delivered a sliver of hope. "There's a new firm, Davis Ventures, a sibling duo out of New York. They've expressed interest in a meeting, and they've got the capital to pull us through." Julia's eyes flicked up, a spark of possibility igniting in her chest, though her expression remained guarded. She'd heard of the Davis twins, Maya and Nathan, rising stars in the investment world, known for their ruthless precision and an uncanny ability to turn failing ventures into gold. "Set it up," Julia said, her voice steady as she adjusted the cuffs of her tailored blazer, her movements precise but betraying a faint tremor of nerves. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that the twins had been watching her for years, their hazel eyes, so eerily similar to her own, burning with a quiet, unyielding purpose that had been simmering for decades, waiting for the right moment to strike. That evening, Julia met her old friend Carl, a retired lawyer who'd known her since her Louisville days, at a dimly lit bar on the edge of the city, the kind of place where the shadows hid as much as the low lighting did. The clink of glasses and murmur of conversation filled the air as Carl sipped his whiskey, his brow creased with concern, his weathered hand steady around the glass. "You ever think about Daniel?" he asked, his voice low, cutting through the hum of the bar like a knife through silk. Julia stiffened, her fingers tightening around her own drink, the name a sharp jab at the past she'd worked so hard to bury. "No," she lied, her tone clipped as she swirled the amber liquid in her glass, the ice clinking softly against the sides. Carl leaned closer, his eyes searching hers, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I ran into his brother a few years back at a conference in Nashville. Daniel raised those twins on his own, never remarried, never even dated from what I hear. They're doing well, Julia, really well." Julia's grip on her glass tightened, her knuckles whitening as a splinter of guilt cracked through the armor she'd worn for decades, the weight of Carl's words settling like a stone in her chest. She'd spent years convincing herself she'd done the right thing, that her life was better without the burden of a family that didn't fit her world, but the truth was a persistent ache she couldn't ignore. Later, alone in her penthouse, Julia couldn't sleep, Carl's words echoing in her mind like a haunting refrain that refused to fade. She paced the hardwood floors, her silk robe trailing behind her, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. She pulled an old photo from a locked drawer. Her wedding day with Daniel, his smile bright and unguarded, his arm around her waist, a moment of joy frozen in time. Her fingers traced his face, her chest tightening with a mix of regret and longing she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She'd told herself she'd moved on, that the past was a closed chapter, but the guilt gnawed at her, a quiet whisper of the life she'd abandoned, the children she'd never known. Meanwhile, in a New York hotel room, Maya Davis smoothed the lapels of her sleek blazer, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands, her reflection in the mirror a study in determination. Her brother Nathan paced nearby, his jaw set, his eyes hard with a resolve that had been forged through years of struggle and triumph. "Tomorrow." "We face her," Maya said, her voice steady but laced with a raw edge of emotion, her fingers brushing against a small locket around her neck, a gift from their father, Daniel, a reminder of the family they'd built without Julia. Nathan stopped pacing, his gaze meeting hers, his voice low and firm. "She'll see what she threw away," he replied, his words a promise, a reckoning 30 years in the making, a storm that was about to break over Julia's carefully constructed world. Julia stood at the head of the conference table, her fingers brushing the edge of her blazer as she steadied herself, the hum of the air conditioning a faint backdrop to the storm brewing inside her. She'd spent hours perfecting her pitch, each statistic and projection a lifeline for her crumbling company, but as the door swung open, her composure faltered. Maya and Nathan Davis stepped into the room, their presence a quiet force that seemed to shift the very air around them. Maya's elegant twists framed her sharp features, her eyes glinting with a determination that felt both fierce and familiar, while Nathan's neat fade and tailored suit exuded a confidence that reminded Julia of someone she couldn't quite place. She rose to greet them, her smile a fragile mask, but the words caught in her throat like a shard of glass. Their hazel eyes, her eyes, stared back at her, and a small birthmark on Nathan's wrist, a perfect match to the one she'd always hidden beneath her watch, sent a chill racing down her spine, as if the past had reached out to seize her with unrelenting hands. "Ms. Harper," Maya said, her voice cool and measured, each word a deliberate step on a path she'd walked in her mind for years. "I'm Maya Davis, and this is my brother Nathan. Thank you for meeting us." Julia shook their hands, her own fingers quivering faintly, her mind a whirlwind of disbelief and dawning dread. Could it be? After 30 years? She gestured to the chairs, her smile forced, her voice a thin thread of control. "Please sit. I'm eager to hear your proposal." Nathan slid a sleek folder across the polished table, his gaze never wavering, his eyes sharp with an intensity that made her chest tighten, as if he could see straight through the walls she'd built around her past. "We've been following your company for a while," he said, his tone edged with a quiet challenge, his fingers resting lightly on the table, steady despite the storm brewing in his own heart. "We see potential, but we also see flaws." Julia opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents, but her thoughts were elsewhere, spiraling back to that sterile hospital room in Louisville, to the tiny infants she'd turned away from in a haze of shame and fear. The resemblance was undeniable, the hazel eyes that mirrored her own, the birthmark that marked Nathan as hers, even the way Maya tilted her head, a gesture so like Daniel's that it felt like a punch to the gut, her throat constricted, a lump forming as she fought to anchor herself in the present, to focus on the numbers in front of her. "Why my company, specifically?" she asked, her voice strained, her fingers gripping the edge of the folder until her knuckles whitened, as if it could tether her to reality. Maya and Nathan exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them, their shared history a bond, forged in the absence of the woman before them. Maya's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth, only a simmering resolve that had been nurtured through years of pain, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she steadied herself for the moment she'd waited for since she was old enough to understand her father's grief. "Let's just say we have a personal interest, Miss Harper, or should we call you Mom?" The room fell silent, the air heavy with shock, the word a dagger that pierced through Julia's carefully constructed world, leaving it to crumble at her feet. Margaret, who'd been scribbling notes in the corner, froze, her pen slipping from her fingers and clattering to the floor, the sound a sharp crack in the suffocating silence. She'd worked with Julia for 15 years, had heard the vague story of a brief first marriage, but this was a revelation that turned everything she thought she knew upside down. Her eyes widened, her breath catching as she looked from Julia to the twins, their resemblance now glaringly obvious, a truth that had been hiding in plain sight. She stood, her movements jerky, her voice hesitant but firm as she gathered her things. "I'll give you some privacy," she said, slipping out of the room, her mind reeling with the weight of what she'd just witnessed, her loyalty to Julia warring with the shock of the moment. Julia barely registered her departure, her gaze locked on the twins, their faces a mix of defiance and pain that cut her deeper than any boardroom loss ever could. "How did you find me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, her hands shaking as she clasped them in her lap, her heart pounding with a fear she hadn't felt since that day in the hospital. Nathan's smile was cold, his eyes hard with a resentment that had been forged through years of struggle, his voice low but cutting. "That's your first question? Not how are you or what happened to your father?" Maya's jaw tightened, her fingers brushing against the locket at her throat, a small silver piece her father had given her on her 10th birthday, a reminder of the family they'd built, without the woman who now sat before them, trembling under the weight of her own past. Julia sat frozen, the conference room shrinking around her, the walls pressing in as the twins' words echoed in her mind, each syllable a hammer against the fragile foundation of her life. Maya leaned forward, her voice steady but laced with a pain that had festered for 30 years, each word a carefully aimed arrow meant to pierce the heart of the woman who'd abandoned them. "We've been watching you for years, building our empire while you built yours on a foundation of lies," she said, her hazel eyes blazing with a fire that mirrored Julia's own but sharpened by a lifetime of rejection, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if to anchor herself against the flood of emotions threatening to spill over. "You walked away from us because we were black, because you couldn't handle the shame." Julia flinched, the accusation cutting through her like a blade, her breath hitching as she tried to respond, to deny the truth that had haunted her for decades. But her voice failed her, her throat tight with the weight of her own guilt, her eyes darting to the floor as if she could escape the piercing gaze of her children. Nathan slid another document across the table, the paper crisp and unyielding. A DNA test with results that left no room for doubt, its black and white clarity a stark contrast to the murky lies Julia had clung to. "We wanted proof before we confronted you," he said, his voice hard, his fingers drumming a slow, deliberate rhythm on the table, a habit he'd picked up from his father during long nights of studying, a reminder of the man who'd raised them with love, where Julia had offered none. "You're our mother, biologically, but you'll never be our mom." Julia stared at the paper, her hands shaking as she reached for it, the evidence of her past staring back at her, undeniable and unforgiving, each line a testament to her failure, each percentage a reminder of the children she'd left behind. She'd spent decades convincing herself the twins weren't hers, that Daniel had betrayed her, that her actions were justified by the betrayal she'd imagined. But the reality was stark, a cold light that illuminated every mistake, every moment of cowardice, every lie she'd told herself to justify her choices. She'd been wrong, terribly, shamefully wrong, and the realization hit her like a tidal wave, threatening to pull her under with its unrelenting force, her chest tightening as she fought back the tears that burned at the edges of her vision. Margaret, who'd lingered just outside the door, her curiosity outweighing her discretion, overheard the exchange, her breath hitching as the pieces of Julia's past fell into place like a puzzle she'd never known she was solving. She'd always admired Julia's business acumen, her ability to navigate a cutthroat world with grace and steel. But she'd also seen her coldness, her refusal to connect on a human level, the way she kept everyone at a distance, as if human connection was a weakness she couldn't afford. This revelation, it changed everything, casting Julia's success in a new, harsher light. Margaret made a quiet decision, her fingers quivering as she pulled out her phone and texted a contact at a local news outlet, her message short but explosive, her thumbs moving swiftly over the screen as she typed. "Julia Harper's past just caught up with her," she wrote, her heart racing as she pictured the headlines that would follow. "Her abandoned twins are here to save her company, or destroy it." She hit send, her pulse pounding in her ears as she slipped away down the corridor, knowing the story would spread like wildfire, a spark that would ignite a firestorm Julia couldn't outrun. Her loyalty to her boss, now overshadowed by the need for the truth to be known. Julia looked up at the twins, her voice hoarse, barely above a whisper, as she tried to piece together a defense, a justification for the unforgivable, her hands twisting together in her lap as she struggled to find the words. "I was young, scared. I thought your father had been unfaithful. I didn't understand genetics. Didn't know about his African ancestry," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of her own excuses, her eyes pleading for a forgiveness she knew she didn't deserve. Maya's laugh was sharp, slicing through the air like a whip, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and disbelief, her fingers tightening around the locket as if drawing strength from her father's memory. "And you didn't bother to find out, you ran," she said, her voice a mix of scorn and sorrow, the pain of a lifetime spilling into her words. Nathan leaned back, his arms crossed, his posture rigid but his voice steady, each word a deliberate strike meant to force Julia to face the consequences of her actions. "We're here to offer a deal. 50% ownership of Harper Investments. We save your company, but you face your past. Publicly," he said, his gaze unwavering, his jaw set, with a determination that had been forged through years of proving himself in a world that had once rejected him. The stakes higher than Julia had ever imagined. Her empire and her reputation now hanging in the balance, controlled by the children she'd turned her back on 30 years ago, their power over her as undeniable as the DNA test that lay between them on the table. Julia sat in stunned silence, the twins' offer reverberating through her mind like a distant bell, each chime a reminder of the choice she faced. She could refuse, let Harper Investments crumble into dust, and cling to the secret she'd buried for 30 years. But the cost would be her entire legacy, the empire she'd built with sweat and sacrifice. Or she could accept, face the public humiliation head-on, and finally acknowledge the family she'd abandoned in a moment of cowardice. She looked at Maya and Nathan, their faces etched with defiance and the lingering hurt of a lifetime, and for the first time, she saw them not as adversaries, but as her children, resilient, brilliant, and far stronger than the woman who'd turned her back on them. Her chest tightened, a mix of regret and awe swelling within her, her fingers brushing the edge of the table as if seeking an anchor in the storm of her emotions. "I'll do it," Julia said, her voice steady despite the tempest raging inside her, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide the slight quiver that betrayed her nerves. "I'll sign the deal. And I'll tell the world the truth." Maya's expression softened, a flicker of surprise lighting her hazel eyes, her lips parting as if to speak before she caught herself, her fingers relaxing their grip on the chair. Nathan nodded, his jaw tight but his gaze shifting from hostility to a cautious neutrality, his shoulders loosening as he leaned back, the tension in the room easing ever so slightly. The next day, Julia stood at a podium in a packed press room, the cameras flashing like a storm of light, their lenses capturing every tremble in her voice, every flicker of emotion on her face. 30 years ago, I made a terrible mistake," she began, her voice quaking as she forced the words out, her hands gripping the podium's edge until her knuckles paled. "I abandoned my twins, Maya and Nathan, because of my own prejudice. They've returned to save my company and to teach me what courage really means. $95 and not all being lost to time." The story erupted across the news, headlines screaming praise for the twins' brilliance and condemnation of Julia's past sins. The airwaves alive with debates and discussions that reached every corner of the nation. Harper Investments was saved, the twins' investment breathing new life into the firm, their strategic minds turning losses into gains. But Julia's reputation took a bruising blow. the whispers of her past now a public echo she couldn't escape. Yet, as she watched Maya and Nathan take their seats on the board, their presence a beacon of strength amid the chaos, a quiet pride blossomed within her, warming the cold spaces her guilt had carved out over the years. That evening, Julia met Daniel at a quiet cafe, the soft clink of cups and murmur of conversation a gentle backdrop to their first reunion in decades. He looked tired but strong, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed, his eyes warm yet guarded, a faint scar above his brow, a reminder of a long-ago fall. Catching the dim light, his hands, roughened by years of hard work, wrapped around his coffee cup, a stark contrast to the polished nails Julia had always maintained. "I never thought I'd see this day," Daniel said, his voice low and measured, a hint of disbelief threading through his words as he studied her across the table, his fingers pausing mid-sip. Julia reached across, her hand hesitant but earnest, her fingertips brushing his before she pulled back, then tried again, her touch light but deliberate. "I'm so sorry, Daniel. For everything," she whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, the weight of her apology hanging between them like a fragile thread. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching hers, his jaw tightening as memories of their shattered past flickered in his mind, nights spent alone with two infants, the quiet strength it took to raise them without her. Then, slowly, he placed his hand over hers, his touch firm yet gentle, a small gesture of forgiveness that felt like a lifeline pulling her from the depths of her shame. "You're trying now," he said, his voice steady but soft, a flicker of hope breaking through his guarded expression. "That's a start." Back at her office, Margaret approached Julia, her steps cautious, her expression gentler than Julia had ever seen it, the lines of her face softened by a newfound respect. "I leaked the story," she admitted, her voice even but tinged with regret, her hands clasped behind her back, as if to steady herself. "I thought the world deserved to know, and you deserved a chance to make it right." Julia nodded, a lump rising in her throat, and pulled Margaret into a brief, grateful hug, the warmth of the embrace a stark contrast to the cold isolation she'd known for so long. The fallout from Julia's confession rippled far beyond Chicago, a wave of change that swept through boardrooms and communities alike. Harper Investments launched a diversity initiative, spearheaded by Maya and Nathan, their vision ensuring fair hiring practices and community outreach programs that reached into underserved neighborhoods, their offices buzzing with new energy as they trained staff to embrace inclusivity. Julia stepped back from her CEO role, taking an advisory position to focus on rebuilding her fractured family ties, her days now filled with tentative phone calls and awkward lunches rather than high-stakes meetings. She and Daniel began meeting weekly, their conversations hesitant at first, filled with long pauses and careful words, but growing warmer with each encounter, a fragile bridge forming over the chasm of their past. His laughter, a sound she'd forgotten, slowly returning to her life. Maya and Nathan, now revered leaders in the financial world, spoke at conferences about resilience and accountability, their story a beacon that inspired countless others, their voices steady as they shared the pain of rejection and the power of redemption. At a New York gala, Julia stood beside her twins, the room aglow with chandeliers and the hum of conversation, watching as Nathan accepted an award for innovative leadership, the polished trophy gleaming in his hands. "We're here because of our father," Nathan said into the microphone, his voice firm, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling on Julia with a nod of acknowledgement. "And because our mother finally chose to face the truth." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a thunderous testament to the family's journey, the sound washing over Julia like a wave of acceptance she'd never known. She felt Daniel's hand slip into hers, his grip warm and steady, his touch a quiet anchor that grounded her in the moment. And she knew this, standing with her family, their triumphs hers to share, was worth more than any corporate success she'd ever chased. A montage of social media posts scrolled across screens worldwide, each one a story of overcoming prejudice, their words a chorus of solidarity that echoed Julia's own redemption. One post read, I faced racism too. Thank you, Maya and Nathan. Alongside a photo of a protest sign held high in a rainy park, the ink smudged but the message clear. Another showed a young boy clutching a Truth Matters banner, his grin wide as he stood beside his mother, her arm around him in a protective embrace. Julia watched from her living room, a soft smile curving her lips as Maya led a workshop for young entrepreneurs, her voice confident as she guided a room full of eager faces, her hands gesturing animatedly with a worn planner in hand. She saw her legacy in her daughter, a future built on the lessons of her mistakes, the weight of her past lifting with each new story of hope. The impact stretched nationwide, with companies adopting new policies inspired by the Davis twins' example, their offices humming with diversity training sessions and community partnerships, the ripple effect touching lives far beyond Chicago. Protests for equality gained momentum, signs reading "Inclusion Now" and "End Prejudice" waving in the air at rallies from coast to coast, their colors bright against the gray of city streets. Julia and Daniel watched the news together, the flicker of the screen casting light on their faces, his arm resting lightly on the couch behind her, a silent sign of their growing bond. "This is just the beginning," Julia said, her voice tinged with quiet resolve, her fingers tracing the edge of a photo album she'd started to fill with new memories. Daniel squeezed her shoulder, his eyes reflecting her determination, a shared understanding that the fight wasn't over, but the spark they'd ignited wouldn't fade. Maya organized a community event, her notes scribbled on a worn planner, the pages dog-eared from months of planning, her ideas bold as she addressed a diverse crowd in a packed hall. "We can change the narrative," she said, her voice gaining strength, her gaze sweeping over the faces before her, many of whom nodded in agreement. A shy woman named Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling but honest, her hands twisting a scarf as she spoke. "I was judged for my skin color too. I'm here because of you," she said, her eyes meeting Maya's, a spark of courage lighting her features. Julia listened from the back, her heart swelling with admiration at her daughter's leadership, her mind drifting to that hospital room 30 years ago, the shame that had driven her away and how it had led to this, her child inspiring others to rise above their own pain. At a rally in Atlanta, Julia addressed a sea of hundreds, her voice carrying over the murmurs, the crowd's energy lifting her words. "We all have a chance to make things right," she said, pointing to a young man holding a sign that read, "Justice begins here," his eyes fierce with purpose as he nodded back at her. The crowd roared, their voices a powerful chorus, the sound reverberating through the warm Georgia air. A teacher from Seattle posted online, "The Davis twins inspired my students to fight bias, thank you," alongside a photo of a classroom project on equality, crayons scattered across desks in a burst of color. The movement grew, with leaders pledging to address systemic racism, their commitments echoing the courage of the family that had sparked it all, the impact a testament to the power of truth. Julia sat with Daniel one evening, the news replaying clips of the protests, the screen casting a soft glow over their faces, his hand resting gently on hers. "You gave them a voice," he said, his tone warm but sure, a pride in his eyes that mirrored her own. She smiled, leaning into him, her mind on Maya and Nathan and the change they were driving, the legacy they were building together. It wasn't just redemption, it was transformation, a ripple that would grow into a wave, reshaping the world, one story at a time. She turned to an imagined audience, her voice a call to action, steady and inviting. What about you? Have you faced prejudice? Share your story below. Like, comment, and subscribe to join the fight for equality.